The wind was a blade, sharp and relentless, scouring the last vestiges of warmth from Ilara's bones. It tore at her worn coat and whipped her horse's mane into a frenzy, driving ice crystals into their skin like 1,000 tiny needles. The sky, a bruised and churning gray, had swallowed the sun hours ago, leaving the Wyoming high country in a state of desolate twilight. Her horse, Bones, a creature of stubborn heart but fading strength, stumbled for the third time in as many minutes. Each falter sent a spike of pure, cold fear through Ilara, a dread far deeper than the bite of the blizzard. If he went down, they would die here. It was a simple, brutal equation. Her flight from the ruins of her life, a ranch sold for pennies on the dollar, a father's grave still fresh, a future erased by a banker's pen, would end here, a frozen monument to failure. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, threatening to buckle her knees. She was nothing but a ghost haunting a land that no longer wanted her. Through the shrieking chaos of the storm, a flicker. Not a star, not a trick of the exhausted eye. It was a sliver of orange light, steady and defiant against the maelstrom. It bloomed and vanished between the curtains of falling snow, a promise so faint it felt like a hallucination. Hope, a dangerous and unfamiliar sensation, surged through her. She slid from the saddle, her legs nearly giving way, and tugged on Bones's reins. "Come on, boy," she rasped, her voice a raw tear in the fabric of the wind. "Just a little farther." Shelter, the word was a prayer. Each step was an agony. The snow was a greedy mire, sucking at her boots, trying to pull her down into its suffocating embrace. The light was their only compass in the whiteout, a fragile beacon in a world determined to extinguish them. It led them to a sheer rock face, a dark gash in the stone hidden by a thick overhang of ancient juniper. The light spilled from a carefully covered opening, a hide stretched over a crude frame. It was a dwelling carved from the bones of the mountain itself. Smoke, thin and smelling of pine, curled from a fissure in the rock above. It was a place meant to be hidden, meant to be overlooked. A place of survival. She hesitated, her hand hovering near the frozen leather of the rifle scabbard on Bones's saddle. This land was not empty. To seek shelter from one danger was often to walk directly into another. But the horse shuddered violently behind her, a low groan rumbling in its chest. The choice had been made for them. Taking a breath that burned her lungs, she pulled back the hide flap and stepped out of the storm and into the firelight. The sudden warmth was a shock, the silence a deafening roar after the howl of the wind. The space was larger than it had appeared from the outside, a natural hollow in the rock, deepened and shaped by human hands. A fire pit in the center cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, which were hung with tanned hides, dried herbs, and tools of a design she did not recognize. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, roasting meat, and something else, something wild and clean. 2 men were there. They had risen to their feet in a single, fluid motion, their stillness more menacing than any sudden movement. They were Apache, she knew instantly from their features, the line of their jaws, the unbroken quiet in their dark eyes. One was older, his face a testament to hardship, carved with lines of grim endurance. The other was younger, his gaze sharp and questioning, his hands resting near a long knife at his belt. Neither spoke. They simply watched her, their expressions unreadable, their presence filling the small space with a powerful, coiled tension. Ilara stood dripping on the packed earth floor, the melted snow from her coat forming a puddle at her feet. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, a silent assessment that stripped her down to her most basic elements, a lone woman, desperate, an intruder. She pushed the hood of her coat back, letting them see her face, the exhaustion etched into it. Her own fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she forced herself to stand straight, to meet their gaze without flinching. Her father had taught her that. Never show a predator you are afraid. She gestured with her chin back toward the raging storm. "My horse," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's failing. We need shelter. Just until it passes." The older man's eyes flickered past her to the hide flap, as if he could see through it to the suffering animal outside. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the muffled scream of the wind. The silence stretched, becoming a language of its own, a negotiation of trust and threat. Elara did not plead. She did not offer money she did not have. She simply stated her need and waited for their judgment. The younger brother shifted his weight, his eyes narrowing. It was the older one who finally gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was not a welcome, not an invitation to friendship. It was a temporary truce with the elements, an acknowledgement of a shared code that even in this harsh, unforgiving land, you did not leave a soul to the mercy of a blizzard. He spoke, his voice low and gravelly, the words in his own tongue directed at his brother. The younger one gave her a final, lingering look of suspicion before disappearing back into the storm. The older man pointed to a spot near the fire, away from their own bedrolls. "Your horse will be tended," he said, his English measured and sparse, as if each word was a carefully considered cost. "You will rest." Elara sank to the ground, the strength leaving her legs in a sudden rush. She watched him move back to the fire, his movements economical and precise. He had granted her sanctuary, but the unspoken terms hung heavy in the air. She was a guest born of necessity, a stranger in a hidden world, and she understood that this shelter came with a price yet to be named. The storm raged for 3 days. It was a relentless siege, sealing the three of them in their stone womb. Time lost its familiar rhythm, measured now only by the stoking of the fire, the quiet preparation of meals, and the long stretches of profound silence. For Elara, it was a period of intense, quiet observation. She learned their names through their brief interactions: Tarza, the older brother, the anchor of their small world, and Nikan, the younger, whose watchfulness was a constant, palpable presence. They moved with a shared understanding that required few words, a lifetime of communication compressed into glances and subtle gestures. They showed her where to find water from a seep deep within the cave and shared their food without ceremony: tough, smoked jerky and a thick stew of rabbit and wild roots. It was more than she had eaten in a week. In return, she offered the only thing she had, her competence. When Nikan brought her saddle and tack in from the cold, its leather stiff and cracked, she set to work. Using the small tin of tallow she always carried, she meticulously cleaned and worked the leather by the firelight, her hands moving with a familiar, practiced grace. It was the work of her former life, a muscle memory that brought a small, sharp ache of nostalgia. Tarza watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. He saw the way her stitches were even and strong, the way she tested every buckle and strap. He saw not a helpless woman, but a person of skill. One morning, she woke to find Bone standing just inside the cave's entrance, sheltered from the worst of the wind. A clean blanket was draped over his back. Nikan had rubbed him down and fed him a mash of something that smelled of oats and herbs. The gesture was a quiet admission, a crack in the wall of his suspicion. He had seen the way she cared for the animal, and he understood that bond. Slowly, a fragile ecosystem of trust began to form in the silence. They did not ask her where she came from or where she was going. The unspoken rule of the high country was that a person's past was their own burden to carry. They did not pry, and she did not offer. Yet, in the shared space, stories were told without words. Elara saw the carefully preserved cradleboard tucked into a high crevice in the rock, its beadwork intricate and beautiful. It spoke of a family that once was, of a mother's love, of a life violently disrupted. She saw the grief in the way Tarza's hands would sometimes still in his work, his gaze lost in the flames. She, in turn, revealed herself in small ways. In the calluses on her hands that spoke of ropes and reins, not needlepoint. In the tired but unbroken set of her jaw. They saw a resilience in her that mirrored their own. They were all survivors of a world that had tried to erase them. She was running from the laws of men written on paper, they were running from the laws of men written in blood. The realization settled in her not with a shock, but with a slow, dawning sense of kinship. The silence was their common ground. It was not empty, but filled with the weight of things unsaid. They would sit for hours by the fire, Elara mending a tear in her shirt, Tarza sharpening a set of skinning knives, Nikan carving a piece of juniper wood, the shavings falling silently to the floor. In these moments, Elara felt a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The constant, gnawing anxiety that had been her companion for months began to recede, replaced by the simple, grounding reality of the present moment, the warmth of the fire, the solidness of the rock around her, the steady breathing of the men who had saved her life. She was no longer just an intruder. She was a part of the quiet rhythm of the cave, a temporary resident of their hidden world. She knew it could not last. The storm would break, and she would have to leave. The thought, which should have been a relief, now carried a strange and unexpected pang of regret. She had stumbled into this sanctuary by accident, a place outside the cruelties of the world she knew, and the thought of returning to that world felt like stepping back into the blizzard. The world inside these stone walls had become safer than the one that lay in wait outside. On the morning of the fourth day, a profound silence woke her. The wind had finally died. A pale, watery sunlight filtered through the hide flap, painting a stripe of light across the earthen floor. The world was reborn, pristine and white under a blanket of fresh snow. It was time to go. The knowledge settled in her stomach like a stone. She packed her few belongings into her saddlebags, her movement slow and deliberate. She folded the blanket they had given her and placed it neatly on her bedroll. Bones, looking stronger and more rested than he had in weeks, nickered softly when she approached, nudging her hand. Tarza and Nikan stood by the fire, watching her. The truce was over. She was a stranger again, preparing to depart. She turned to face them, the words of thanks feeling inadequate, hollow. "I am in your debt," she said, her voice clear and formal in the quiet cave. "You saved our lives," and Nikan simply nodded, his expression as guarded as it had been on the first night. But Tarza's gaze was different. It was heavy, considering. He looked from her to his brother, a silent conversation passing between them. He then turned his full attention back to Elara, his eyes holding hers. For a moment, she thought he would simply wish her well and let her ride away into the vast, lonely wilderness. Instead, he spoke, and his words changed everything. "We have a request," Tarza said, the statement landing with quiet force in the still air. Elara waited, her hands growing still on her saddlebags. A request. Not a demand for payment, but something else. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Did they need supplies from town? A message delivered? She was prepared to offer anything she could. Tarza gestured to the cradleboard tucked high in the rock crevice. "There are other things. Like that. From our mother. Our father. They are hidden in the place we lived." Before he paused, choosing his words with immense care. It was a summer camp. In the foothills. The Blue Creek Canyon. Elara knew the area. It was a good 2 days' ride from here, closer to the settled lands. Closer to the men who had taken her ranch. A cold finger of apprehension traced its way down her spine. "The snow is deep now," Tarza continued, his voice a low rumble. "The animals that dig, the men who ride, they may find the cache. We must move them. Bring them here." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoicism in his eyes. It was a deep, abiding grief, mingled with a fierce, protective urgency. It was the look of a man trying to hold on to the last fragments of a shattered world. Nikan stepped forward, his usual suspicion replaced by the same quiet intensity as his brother. "It is a difficult journey. 2 of us to carry, but the path is narrow in places. Treacherous. We need a 3rd. To guide the pack mule." To stand watch. The strangeness of the request began to dawn on Elara. They were not asking for a simple favor. They were asking her to partake in something deeply personal, profoundly sacred. They were asking her to be the guardian of their history, the keeper of their family's memory. It was an act of immense, almost reckless trust. To show an outsider the location of not 1, but 2 of their secret places. To entrust her with the last, precious remnants of their people. In their world, a world of betrayal and loss, such a request was unheard of. They had watched her for 3 days. They had judged her silence, her skill, her spirit. And they had decided she was worthy of that trust. They saw not a white woman, an enemy by default, but a fellow survivor. The weight of their faith in her was heavier than any blizzard. She looked from Tarza's steady gaze to Nikan's expectant face. She thought of her own past, scattered and lost. Her mother's locket, sold to pay a debt. Her father's rifle, now in the hands of a stranger. She understood the desperate need to hold onto the pieces that defined you, the tangible links to those you had loved. To leave now, to ride away in search of her own solitary future, felt like a betrayal not only of them, but of a part of herself she was just beginning to rediscover. There was no other choice to be made. "I will help you," she said. The words were simple, but they were a vow. A partnership was forged, not in a contract or a handshake, but in a shared understanding of loss and the fight to preserve what remains. The journey began at dawn the next day. The world was a blinding expanse of white, the air so cold it felt brittle. Tarzan led the way on foot, his powerful frame breaking a path through the deep snow. Nikan followed, leading their sturdy pack mule, and Ilara brought up the rear on Bones, her rifle resting across her lap. A profound quiet settled over their small caravan, the only sounds the rhythmic crunch of snow and the huff of their own breath misting in the frigid air. They moved with a focused, silent efficiency that Ilara found herself admiring. Every action was deliberate, every glance held meaning. A hand signal from Tarzan was all it took for them to halt, for Nikan to scan the ridge lines, for Ilara to listen to the stillness for any sound that was out of place. She was no longer just an observer of their world, she was an active participant in its rhythms, its caution, its constant state of alert. Her own senses, dulled by months of grief and aimless wandering, sharpened. She noticed the subtle track of a fox in the snow, the way the wind whispered differently through the pines than it did through the aspens. She was becoming a part of the landscape again, not just a trespasser upon it. They made camp the first night in a dense copse of spruce that offered some protection from the wind. While Tarzan and Nikan built a small, smokeless fire in a pit lined with stones, Ilara tended to the animals, rubbing them down with handfuls of snow before blanketing them securely. The work was familiar, grounding. She shared her small store of oats with their mule, a quiet offering of partnership. As they ate their sparse meal of jerky and hard bread, the stars emerged in the ink-black sky, impossibly bright and close in the cold, clear air. Nikan, in a rare moment of unguardedness, pointed out a constellation with the tip of his knife. "The Great Bear," he said softly. "Our people have a different name for it." He did not say the name, but the act of sharing, of pointing to a common map in the sky, was enough. It was a bridge built across the silence. Ilara felt a sense of belonging that was both startling and deeply comforting. For months, she had been defined by what she had lost. Here, trekking through a frozen wilderness with two Apache brothers on a sacred mission, she was being defined by what she was doing. She was a protector, a partner, a keeper of trust. They reached the Blue Creek Canyon late the next afternoon. It was a deep scar in the earth, its sides steep and choked with ancient, snow-laden firs. Tarzan led them down a bare leather trail, a treacherous path of switchbacks and icy ledges. Here, Ilara's role became crucial. While Tarzan and Nikan navigated the most perilous sections, she kept the nervous animals calm, her low, steady voice a constant reassurance. Her skill with horses, once just a part of her daily life, was now an essential contribution to their shared goal. At the bottom of the canyon, by a frozen creek, Tarzan stopped. He pointed to a seemingly unremarkable pile of rocks and fallen timber at the base of a cliff face. "There," he said. Working together, they began to carefully remove the debris. Underneath was a heavy, oilcloth-wrapped bundle, tied securely with rawhide. As Tarzan and Nikan gently lifted it, Ilara stood watch, her gaze sweeping the rim of the canyon above them. A flicker of movement caught her eye. High on the opposite ridge. Not a deer. Two riders, silhouetted against the pale afternoon sky. A jolt of ice-cold recognition shot through her. The distinctive slump of one rider's posture, the aggressive set of the other's shoulders. The Sanderson brothers. The men who had swindled her, who had stood by with predatory smiles as the auctioneer sold her father's legacy for a pittance. They were here. And they were coming down. "Riders," she said, her voice low and urgent. Tarzan and Nikan froze, their hands still on the precious bundle. They followed her gaze, their bodies instantly tensing, becoming weapons of coiled muscle and readiness. They moved with a speed that was breathtaking, hustling the bundle and the animals into the deeper shadows of the cliff face. Tarza grabbed his own rifle from its scabbard. "You know them?" he asked, his eyes locked on the descending figures. "They are the ones who took my land," Ilara said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Jed and Marcus Sanderson. They are cruel men." And greedy, a grim understanding passed between the three of them. The danger had just escalated from discovery to a direct confrontation with the very worst of the world they had all sought to escape. Jed and Marcus rode with a careless arrogance, their horses trampling the pristine snow, their loud voices echoing unnaturally in the canyon's silence. They were hunting, but not for deer. They were sweeping the country for stray cattle, for anything of value they could claim as their own. They reined in their horses 20 yards away, their eyes falling on Ilara, then on the two Apache men beside her. Marcus, the bigger of the two, spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the white snow. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered, his gaze crawling over Ilara with possessive insolence. "Little LMA, run off to play with the natives," Jed chuckled, a nasty, grating sound. "Thought you'd cleared out. What are you doing down here? And what are they doing on land that's now part of the Sanderson holdings?" Ilara felt a surge of cold fury. She stepped forward slightly, placing herself between the Sandersons and the brothers. "This is not your land, Jed. And we are just passing through. Marcus's eyes narrowed, fixing on the disturbed pile of rocks and the hastily concealed pack mule. "Looks more like you're digging for something. We find anything of value on this land, it belongs to us." The threat was clear. This was not about trespassing. It was about plunder. Tarza stepped up beside Ilara, his rifle held loosely at his side, but with a readiness that was unmistakable. Nikan mirrored him on her other side, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. They stood as a single, defiant unit. "There is nothing here for you," Tarza said, his voice flat and cold as the creek ice. "You should leave." Jed's face darkened with rage. The audacity of being told what to do by a man he considered a savage was more than his petty pride could bear. "You don't give me orders, boy," he snarled, his hand drifting toward the pistol on his hip. The air grew thick, electric with imminent violence. The canyon held its breath. It was Ilara who broke the standoff. She knew these men. She knew their bluster was built on a foundation of cowardice. They were bullies who only fought when they were certain they would win. "You remember Marshal Abernathy in Rawlins?" she asked, her voice calm and cutting. Both Sandersons flinched. "He took a keen interest in the paperwork from my father's auction. Said there were irregularities. He told me if I ever saw you two bothering me again, I was to send word. He'd be very interested to know you were out here, harassing folks and claiming land that isn't yours." It was a bluff, but a brilliant one. She had spoken to the marshal, but he had offered little more than sympathy. Yet, the seed of doubt was planted. The risk of a federal marshal investigating their shady dealings was a far greater threat than a skirmish in a desolate canyon. Jed and Marcus exchanged a look of uncertainty. Their greed warred with their fear of the law. They looked at the three silent, unmoving figures before them, the determined woman they had underestimated and the two Apache men who looked as if they were carved from the canyon rock itself, promising a fight that would be far more costly than they had anticipated. Marcus grunted, his bravado deflating. "This ain't worth the trouble," he muttered, pulling on his reins. Jed glared at Ilara one last time, his eyes filled with venom. "This ain't over, LMA." He spurred his horse viciously, and the two of them retreated back up the trail, their departure as loud and ugly as their arrival. The silence they left behind was vast and profound. Ilara stood trembling, the adrenaline slowly draining away, leaving her feeling hollowed out. Nikan let out a long, slow breath. Tarza looked at her, and in his eyes, there was a new light. It was not just trust anymore. It was respect. Deep, hard-won respect. "You fought with wisdom, not just fire," he said, the words a high honor. In the face of the ghosts from her past, she had not been a victim. She had been a protector. She had stood her ground, not for land or for money, but for the dignity of her newfound partners. The precious bundle was safe. They had faced the threat together, and together, they had prevailed. The return journey was different. The silence was no longer one of wary observation, but of comfortable companionship. The shared danger had burned away the last vestiges of distance between them. They moved as one, a cohesive unit bound by the ordeal in the canyon. When they finally saw the familiar silhouette of the rock face that concealed their shelter, Ilara felt a feeling she had thought was lost to her forever, the feeling of coming home. Inside the cave, the fire was stoked, and the warmth enveloped them like a blessing. With great reverence, Taza and Nikan unwrapped the oilcloth bundle. Inside, nestled in soft rabbit furs, were the treasures they had risked everything to retrieve. There was a set of finely beaded moccasins, a carved wooden flute, a leather pouch filled with smooth, painted stones, and a worn buckskin sheath holding a knife with a handle of polished antler. They were not items of monetary value, but they were priceless. They were the soul of a family, the tangible evidence of a life lived, of love and skill and tradition. Taza held the knife, his thumb tracing the worn antler. "My father's," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Nikan gently lifted the moccasins. "My mother made these, for the sister we lost." He looked at Ilara, his gaze direct and open. "Thank you." You guarded our memory. The weight of his words settled deep within her. She had done more than help them carry a bundle. She had helped them carry their grief and preserve their legacy. The next morning, the sun rose bright and clear. The world was open to her again. There was nothing stopping her from saddling Bones and riding away. She could head for Oregon, or California, try to start a new life from nothing. The thought filled her not with anticipation, but with a profound emptiness. She looked around the cave, at the quiet order, the flickering firelight, the two men who now felt more like family than the distant cousins who had turned their backs on her. She looked at her own hands, capable and strong. She had skills. She had courage. She had a place here. The choice became clear, not as a resignation, but as a declaration. She found Taza outside, gazing out at the vast, snow-covered landscape. "When I came here, I was running," she said, the admission costing her a sliver of her pride. "I don't want to run anymore." He turned to her, his expression calm, patient. "This is a hard life," he said. It was not a deterrent, but a statement of fact. "I know," she replied. "But my horse is strong. My rifle is true. And I am a better mender of tack than either of you." A rare, faint smile touched the corners of Taza's mouth. "This is true. I have no money to offer," she continued, "but I can work. I can help. I can earn my place." She was not asking for charity. She was proposing a partnership, an alliance of survivors. He held her gaze for a long moment, the silent communication passing between them once more. He saw not the desperate woman who had stumbled out of the storm, but the resilient ally who had faced down her own demons to protect them. He saw a kindred spirit. He gave a single, decisive nod. "Our home is your home," he said. It was all that needed to be said. A wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees washed over Ilara. The emptiness inside her was filled with a new, quiet strength. She was no longer Ilara, the dispossessed. She was Ilara, guardian of memories, partner in survival, a woman who had found her family not in a house built of timber, but in a sanctuary carved from stone and trust. She looked out at the endless horizon, not as a lonely road to be endured, but as a frontier to be faced, together.